Hello recruits, this is Robbie Grayson and General Schneider, and this is lesson number 5 in Bootcamp with the General. In the last lesson we talked about dedication, and we said that dedication was the ability to bridge the difference between big vision and the smallest detail. In this lesson we're going to talk about magnanimity, which is the ability to display a genuine concern for others. General Schneider, in the last lesson we talked about dedication. And we talked about how dedication was the ability to bridge between big vision and the smallest detail. And, you know, as we talk about each of these character traits, they get more and more complex, I guess. And this one we're going to talk about magnanimity, which some people would define as generosity. But I want to ask you, how has being magnanimous to others come back to bless you down the road?
Well, one thing that comes to mind, you know, I went into combat in Korea back when the war started in 1950. And we all knew that somebody wasn't going to make it back. So we had a meeting together and agreed that we'd visit the other guys' families, whoever survived. And some of the other guys did the same thing, and I traveled around the country and visited families of the buddies that didn't make it. And we lost 22 out of 32 that started out together. So it was a big, very emotional. It was sometimes tougher than flying combat because of the emotion involved. But I visited a family down in Florida that was one of my buddies, and they just almost literally adopted me in his place. And I've been part of that family now. I call it my second family ever since the Korean War. And one of the nieces now has just moved to Nashville, and I had lunch with her husband this week, and he said, she really looks at you as your Uncle Carl. This is as though you're a blood relative. So it's meant a lot to them, and it's meant a lot to me. It's just been a wonderful experience. They're great people, and we've gone to all their family reunions, and my daughter called his parents Grandma and Grandpa, and when she was a little girl, and so it's been a great experience. And one of the other portions was one that I didn't get to visit. One of the other guys visited, but about a few years ago, I was on the internet, and I had something about, does anybody know any of the guys that were killed during the early days of the Korean War? And so I answered this email, and this lady called me from San Francisco, and she said, did you happen to know my dad? Said he was Captain Myers. And I said, yeah, he was the first one that we lost in Korea. And she said, well, here's the story. I remembered that when she was born, because just before we went to Korea, he was passing out cigars to his first daughter and so forth. And she said that her mother never would talk to her. Of course, she was just a baby. Would never talk about her father, and she got remarried about a year after he died, or he was missing. He was never found. He was bailed out, and wasn't in prison camp. Don't know what happened to him. But anyway, she's a pretty well-known artist now in San Francisco. She said, I'm coming down to Arizona to meet you. So she came down, and I got out all the pictures of her dad and told her all about her dad. And even a couple other guys that were still living, I called them, and they talked to her and so forth. So anyway, she said that really gave her closure after all those years that she just didn't know anything about her father. And another example of magnanimity, I think a major story that many folks don't know, is at the end of the Civil War, when General Lee surrendered to General Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. General Grant said, okay, one of the terms was that all your troops can keep their weapons and their horses and go back home. There was no recriminations, no prison camps, and that really made a difference in the transition of the Reconstruction after the Civil War, because they could go back and still had their weapons to hunt with, and they were not. Of course, it went along with President Lincoln's philosophy. You know, he didn't want a big trial or anything else to try to heal a nation. So that to me is one of the major problems of magnanimity that I know of. They're just absolutely gracious to do that. And just in daily life, people need to show more respect and appreciation and gratitude for people that do things for you. It really makes a big difference. So I use a system, a card system that I use, that I can just do it on the computer, hit the button, and it goes to Salt Lake, and they print the card and send it out. And it takes about 2 minutes. You can personalize it and so forth. But just a handwritten note makes a lot of difference many times to thank people for the things they do for you. So you need to show a lot. We need to show a lot more appreciation and gratitude.
Right. You described to me how throughout your military career you never wrote an Article 15. Explain what an Article 15 is, and then explain why you did not write.
Well, I don't know anybody that went through 32 years in the military and never gave an Article 15 is an admonishment, or it's a correction that goes in your records, and it can keep you from getting promoted.
Right.
It's really a serious situation for some offense that you've had against the Uniform Code of Military Justice, and then a court-martial is something that's really serious. That can get you kicked out of the service, or get you in Leavenworth or prison. And I had some guys, and that, of course, in my day we had very few women in the. We had none that I had in uniform at that time in the fighter outfit, but a lot of them stepped out of bounds. And I would call them in, and I'd sit down and very calmly I'd say, "Well, what are we going to do about this?" Well, usually they would give themselves more punishment than I would have given them, right. And consequently, they were on report. Now, they'd lose face if they went back on their word. And one good example, I had a captain that wrote a bad check up in Las Vegas, and the commander of Tactical Air Command had said the next officer that writes a bad check is going to automatically get kicked out of the Air Force. Well, anyway, he came back on Sunday afternoon and came over to my house. And he said, "Boss," he said, "I really screwed up." He said, "I know what the story is." And I said, "I know what the punishment is." But he said, "I've got this." I said, "I started gambling." He's a bachelor, and he's sort of a great instructor and great officer, but he was always sort of living on the edge. And I said, "Well," I called him in. I said, "Okay, well, what are we going to do about it?" He said, "Well, I think I should spend a month as a range officer down in the desert." I said, "Good, that's a good start." So, no flying. So he went down, did a great job, and he came back from that. He said, "Okay, what else should I do?" And he gave himself some more dirty details. Anyway, long story short, about a month later, my wing commander called me and he said, "Carl," he said, "the 4-star general up at Tactical Air Command in Virginia has decreed, or has put out an order that Captain Pitchford is to come up there to meet a 36-2 board, which means drumming out of the Corps," and said he has said that they're going to find him guilty. I said, "Well, that's command influence, and I don't like that." And I said, I have punished him properly, in my opinion. He's never going to do that again, and I want to defend him." And my boss said, "I don't think that's a very good career move." And I said, "You're laying your career on." I said, "Yep." I said, "If they're going to kick him out, they can kick me out." Wow. So I said, "Furthermore, I want to borrow your airplane to go up there." So we had a twin-seated F-100. So I took him. We flew to Virginia, and they had 3 colonels in the furnace room of an old abandoned World War II building, just about as degrading a situation as you can find. Anyway, they read the charges, and I had my defense made up for the captain, and I exonerated him. They said they found him. They said, "You've given him enough punishment, so that's adequate." So they didn't kick him out. Well, anyway, the end of the story was that he came back. Well, he was straight arrow from then on. Retired as a colonel, but he got shot down in Vietnam and spent about 6 years in prison camp. And it turned out he was a real humorous kind of guy, always positive attitude. And he came back after he got out of prison and said, "Sometimes I wished you hadn't defended me on that." But I talked to a bunch of the prisoners, and they said he really kept morale up because he was just a positive, fun kind of guy. And so I think it was God's will that happened, because he really helped morale in those years in prison camp in Vietnam.
You know, that's something else, because in your book, Jet Pioneer, almost every other page has, or every few pages has some sort of humor in it that really kind of indicated the, I don't know, how carefree you managed. You know, your management style, it involves some of that humor and that being carefree. And I think you've been able to isolate a principle, which is true, is that if you give people the opportunity to correct themselves, they tend to be harder on themselves.
Yeah, that's right.
And it typically corrects the problem, but it also saves you from having to have been, you know, the bad guy.
Yeah, that's right.
So when it comes to young men who already kind of struggle with their place in this world, if you want to say, they struggle with, you know, the world sometimes comes across very chaotic. And it's very difficult for a young man to want to kind of launch out on his own. You know, how, when should you implement kind of those principles of magnanimity? Is it just to anyone, or do you use it strategically, or?
Well, it depends on the situation, of course, but my first inclination is to listen to them as to what their excuse was, and be compassionate. I guess the word compassion is as good as anything. Another example I had when I was a second lieutenant, I was a squadron adjutant, and I had to pay the troops, and they'd all line up, and we were paying in script, and we had the world's greatest line chief. We were short of mechanics, and so he'd work 22 hours a day to get the airplanes in commission. Just a wonderful mechanic, and so the first day that I paid the troops, he went AWOL for 3 days, and he came back, and I called him in, and I said, "Sarge," I said, "what are we going to do about this?" And he said, "Well, Lieutenant," he said, "here's the deal." He said, "This is what I've done ever since I've been in the Air Force." He said, "I work my tail off 29 days of the month, but said, I take 3 days off when I get paid." Said, "I don't care what they say." he said, "If you want to," said, "you can court-martial me now, but you don't have a line chief." And he said, "You know how hard I work, and we don't have a replacement." And he said, "I'll work my tail off for you," but he said, "I'm going to take 3 days off." And he said, if you want to keep me and you want to keep the outfit going, just slide a 3-day pass under that last piece of paper." And he said, "I'll be legitimate. I'll come back and work my head off." And so that's what I did. And he worked for me then all the way through Korea. You know, terrible conditions, no hangars, working out in cold and heat. But I could have court-martialed him, right? You know, I had every right to court-martial him, but he was my loyal friend from then on. Boy, every month I just slide that little 3-day pass, and he'd be gone. But anyway, I guess compassion is a word, and just try to use common sense. To me, that was common sense. You know, I guess technically I didn't have to. I might have broken a regulation by doing that. I don't know. I never worried too much about it. But my theory was, if they wanted to kick me out, they'd kick me out, and I'd go do something else. And I started 6 businesses after I got out of the Air Force, so I guess I did all right. Well, I think just being compassionate to your classmates and your buddies and your friends. Don't be too critical initially, and I used the example of if they do something that you don't like or that you have a disagreement with, use the term, "What can we do about this?" Sort of share the situation. Many times people will be much more much harder on themselves than you would have by getting all upset and chewing them out and making a deal. So a lot of folks they realize maybe that they did something that was irritating or not right. So that term has really served me well. But when you're trying to resolve a situation, just say, what are we going to do about it? And then let them take the lead and see what they say, if you can agree or disagree. But sometimes that diffuses the situation, and you can do that, start doing that with your friends when you're just a young person, even though you don't have leadership examples. So that would be my idea. Just get in a situation and say, what are we going to do about this?